Hello there. Welcome back to Tuck and Cash. Thanks for joining us for another part of the European Expansion Bootcamp. As always, I have Flan from Winging It joining me for today's episode. So, welcome, Flan. How are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing very well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on again. And should be good to take a look at these end of round goals and new bonus cards as well.
Yeah, this is one of the last few things that we haven't looked at. Previously, we've looked at all the new bird, new brown power, teal power. So if you want to check out previous episode, please go to my channel and also Flan's channel, Winging It. Today we're gonna talk about first the end of round goals. So the first end of round goal we're looking at here is cards in hand. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's quite a tricky one because, normally you don't want to have too many cards in your hand. And I think
Yeah,
particularly, this is I don't really know where this works as an end of round goal because I think
right.
for the first end of round, it's quite difficult. You normally
Mm-hmm.
don't have that much of a wetlands, so you're going to struggle to get that many cards.
Yeah,
But equally, if this is the last end of round goal,
yeah,
what are you going to do with all those cards at the end of the game? It feels a bit strange. So, yeah, it's probably one as well that is quite difficult to, you know, compare with your opponents how well you're doing because
right.
I think something like the egg ones in the base game or birds in a habitat, you can kind of expect, okay, I'm a couple of birds ahead, so I'm probably safe. But with cards in hand, you don't know if your opponent's just going to draw cards twice to try and win it, and trying to sort of plan your turns around that, I think, could be quite tricky.
Yeah. With that being said, I wish in the digital wingspan there's a way to check the number of
Mm,
cards your opponent have in hand. Yeah, without knowing that, it could be kind of hard to judge for this end of round goal. I think this end of round goal, I mean, if I have to guess, like maybe it's a design to kind of give a consolation, a compensation for player in situation where you draw a lot of cards, but most of them are unplayable at the
mm.
moment or they are just crappy birds. So at least you can score some extra points with this. So yeah, it's a quite tricky one, I agree. And then, yeah, moving on, we have the number of brown powers. This one is like the opposite of the first one. I feel like brown powers in general are already pretty good, so now you get rewarded by having more brown powers bird on the board.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, if this is maybe in the first or second end of round goal, you already want to be trying to get as many brown powers down as possible. So I think certainly it is going to reward players that are trying to build up an engine, certainly in that early game.
Yeah. And then moving on, we have birds in one row. So like in each habitat, how many birds you have. Um, yeah, again, this is quite interesting. I imagine it can be quite competitive in early game.
Mm,
Because like, in first one or two round, usually you only have like, one or two birds in each habitat.
right.
So yeah, I see a lot of tie
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah. I think this one can play out very differently again, depending on when in the game it is. I think, like you say, in that first round, especially,
Mm-hmm.
if you have two birds in a row, that's
Mm-hmm.
probably it should at least be tying for that first place, if not winning outright. But if this is the last end of round goal,
Mm-hmm.
I think you could expect at least one person to be getting four or even five. So
Yeah.
if you're not focusing entirely on one habitat and trying to build up a good engine and get lots of birds down in one specific habitat to target this end of round, then it can
Mm-hmm.
be quite difficult, I think, to be competitive.
Yeah. So yeah, this definitely remind me of the end of round goal in base game where you count birds in each habitat. So
Right.
this is kind of like a more balanced end of round goal. So it doesn't reward specifically for one player who like, you know, built like a grassland habitat just because it's grassland. But now everyone has a chance to try to win
Right.
this end of round goals.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially the same as all three of those, but you sort of pick the one that you're doing the best in. I think
Yeah.
that's how you can look at it.
Yeah. So everyone has a better chance. And all right, so next we have birds that worth more than 4 points. So we're talking about in general like big point birds that doesn't
Mm.
have as good of a brown power. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about right. If you think about the strongest brown power engine building birds, they're normally worth 4 points or less.
Yeah.
So they're not going to help for this. I think certainly you think about those kind of big point bombs or bonus card birds that you might be playing
Mm-hmm.
later in the game. I think particularly that's where you're going to be really competitive in this end of round goal. But again, you compare to some of these other ones again. Early in the game, you're probably not going to have that many
Right.
birds worth more than 4 points. So even just one of those kind of birds might be enough to get you some points from this. But yeah, if this is end of round goal 3 or 4, then I would expect it to be quite competitive.
Yeah, but I must say though, with the new European expansion, there were quite a few birds that they were introduced where they give you 5 bird points with just one food. So if you're
Mm.
lucky enough to grab like, start with a couple of those birds, then you can be quite competitive in early game for this end of round goal.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. All right, we have birds with tuck cards. Again, this is an interesting one. That's definitely, with the European expansion, we have a lot more birds that were being introduced that allows you to massively tuck cards. So, yeah, what do you think about this end of round goals?
Yeah, I think it's quite tricky.
Mm-hmm.
I've had this one come up a few times,
Yeah.
and in most cases, you have one player with loads of birds with tuck cards, and maybe the others with not so many. So, obviously, this is going to count some of those round end powers, but also the pink powers that let you get tucks. So, I think that's always a good way of being competitive in this. But also, specific kinds of hunting brown powers that's going to help as well. But I think, like you said, it's really the kind of the mass tucking powers that you're looking at. So the chiff chaff and the chaffinch. If you have one of those, you can be pretty comfortable in being competitive for this kind as well.
Yeah. It seems like it's one of those bonus, like end of round goal that you either are competitive or you are not. It's
Right.
just hard to build up, um, because you need to spend turn playing birds that can allow tugs, and then you need to tug. So, unless you're already set up for it, it will be hard to catch up if your opponent already
Yeah.
have a good lead.
Yeah, I think it's one of those where you just try and get one bird down that
Yeah,
can get tuck card just to at least qualify. And in most cases, it is going to be difficult, I think, to be competitive.
yeah. All right. Let's take a look at the flip side of each end of round goes here. So, the first one we have here, food in personal supply. Yeah, so that's basically like the flip of cards in hand. Now we have food in
Right.
supply. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think I kind of look at it quite similarly to cards in hand because,
Yeah.
again, early in the game, getting lots of food, quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And you would normally not want to end that first end of round with loads of food. You want to have spent it getting birds down.
Yeah.
So, potentially if it is early game, you might be slowing your tempo down a little bit to meet this. But equally at the end of the game, no one wants a load of food left over. And I think particularly with some of these new round end powers that have been introduced that let you either cash food or discard food to get extra points at the end of the round. That makes it quite tricky to fit that in with this kind of end of round goal. So yeah, certainly an interesting one and quite difficult to work towards.
All right. And then next we have birds with white and no power.
Yeah, so it's anything that has a when played power
Yeah.
or anything that doesn't have a power at all.
Right.
So yeah, I kind of think of this as the opposite of the brown powers. Obviously, it is the opposite side of the tile as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of those where early game you're probably not going to have that many
Yeah.
white and no powers unless it's something like maybe the Northern Flicker or the Carolina Wren, that kind of bird that actually can help get a bit of tempo. But yeah, certainly if this is the final end of round goal, that's really where a lot of these white and no power birds are going to go down as those big point bombs. So I would
Yeah.
expect that to be quite competitive late in the game.
Yeah. I think this tile give more balance than the brown power side because
Mm,
white like when play power usually only give you one time advantage, but brown power you can
right,
use it like
right.
throughout the game. So I think this compensate for, the less usability of the birds. So
Yeah, I think as well it enhances the strength of double birds. So if
Yeah,
you
that's
can,
right.
use one or more of those, especially if you're using it in conjunction with another white or no power bird, then that can be a really good way to, yeah, be strong and be competitive in this kind of end of round.
All right. The next one we have is fill columns. So, vertical columns. Um, Again, this is very similar to the one in row.
Mm,
This remind me of the base game and around go where you have to count set of eggs in three habitat. So the
yeah.
prerequisite of that is that you need to have like, three birds in each habitat. So can be quite challenging in the early game, like especially round one to score that. So I imagine it would be the same here.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think of it a bit like the ecologist bonus card, but just in end of round format. Like you say, I think early game really tricky to get, even sometimes just to get one filled column. So, you might end up in scenarios where if this is that first end of round goal,
Mm-hmm.
maybe no one's going to get any points.
Yeah.
But certainly, I think even in the middle of the game, getting to two or three filled columns is really, really tricky. So
Yeah.
I think this could be a really interesting one, and yeah, interested to see how it plays out.
Yeah. I can imagine like in the late game it might not be that competitive because like in the late game most of the time like yeah you have three or four
Right.
field column like you I mean I think with the European expansion it's more likely to get to fifth but
Mm.
most of the time it would be three or four so
Yeah, it's interesting though because it is, like with some of these other end of round goals, it is encouraging you to play more birds maybe
yeah
rather than go for the traditional engine. So yeah, it just kind of helps mix things up a little bit more.
yeah. The next one here is really interesting as well. So you count the number
Mm.
of birds with no eggs on it. That's different from what we have seen in base game.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite and really tricky. I think I've experienced this a couple of times in the first round,
Yeah.
and that normally I think, especially if you're going to go first in the second round, you want to have some eggs, particularly if you've only got one wetland bird, because you want to
Right.
be helping your card draw. Or sometimes it's just good to have those eggs so that you can quickly get birds down in that second round and really start building things up. So yeah, having birds with no eggs on them is always tricky, but I think equally late in the game, if this is that final end of round goal, that's almost a nightmare scenario if you're running a
Yeah.
grassland engine because you're going to have so many eggs and you might not have any birds that don't have eggs on. So you've got
Right.
to, plan a little bit carefully to make sure you qualify.
Yeah. So I guess like in late game, like this kind of benefit um game where people are not running like a
Yeah,
grassland engine. So that's interesting.
yeah.
All right, the last one we have here, we count the fruit cost of play birds. So each number of fruit that you use to play the bird. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think again it's quite similar to the white and no powers, that kind of end of round goal, where it is again encouraging you to play lots of birds and lots of high food cost, obviously birds. So yeah, it does I think favor something like a forest engine that is naturally going to be focused on playing lots of big point, high food cost birds. Yeah, I think this is one where early in the game you can quite often end up with ties. I think
Mm-hmm.
that first end of round goal you're probably looking at maybe 5 or 6 food cost, I
Yeah,
think, for most players. So
right.
you might get a few ties there, but certainly late in the game, I think
Yeah.
if you are able to target this and play a lot of those 3 food birds, then absolutely, you can score very highly in this kind of end of round.
Yeah, I agree. All right. I think that's all the new end of round growth from the European expansion. So after we have looked at all of this, any concluding thoughts on the end of round goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of brought this up as we talked about each of them, but certainly the impression I get is that it's all very much away from the egg laying strategy that you kind of see, particularly in the end of round goals in the base game. So, there's 16 end of round goals and 12 of them are to do with egg laying in the base game, whereas here we have 10 and none of them are to do with egg laying. So,
Yeah.
I think it's nice. I think it definitely brings more balance,
Yep.
and you're more likely to get these kind of games that don't have any egg laying requirements in the end of round goal. So, it certainly gives more focus to other kinds of strategies in the game, which I think is always good.
Yeah, I think that was definitely an intentional design because yeah, in the
Yeah.
base game, like a lot of like it's pretty obvious. Like grassland egg laying is like more than half of the time the go-to and reliable strategy, and people say that it's kind of boring. And with this new end of round goals, like you say, really encourage people to diversify the strategy and try out other things. So
Yeah, I think in general it just mixes it up as well. I think a lot of the end of round goals in the base game are really, really similar to each other.
yes,
It might
that's
be
right.
eggs on a certain type of nest, or certain types of nest with eggs in them.
Yep.
Whereas these are all very, very different, and it really does bring a lot of freshness, I think, into the game. And every game you're playing, you're going to come up with lots of different end of round goals. So it certainly helps, keep the game exciting, I think.
All right, I agree as well. So I think that wraps up today episode on the end of round goals. As always, thanks for watching. If you want to check out other parts, please head over to Flan's Winging It channel and also some episode on my channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Thanks, everyone.